This is the Workplace Podcast with your host, William Corliss, brought to you in association with Yellowwood, providers of executive coaching, corporate training and facilitation, your external learning and development partner. Each week, we focus on a different aspect of the workplace. We hear from guest speakers who are subject matter experts and are incredibly talented at what they do. These experts will give you a different perspective and insight to work life, with the aim of empowering you to take a different path to success in all aspects of work life. These perspectives will include career and personal success, leadership, high-performance teams, and creating a better work-life culture in your organisation. Yellowwood. Take a different path to success with your career, team, and organisation.
Welcome to the Workplace Podcast, and joining us today is Dr. Rita Meyerson, organization change expert, executive coach, and adjunct professor. For 25 years, Rita Meyerson has partnered with business executives around the world on matters of organization transformation, culture, and leadership development. She has successfully driven numerous large-scale global organization change efforts that both met business goals and built high-performance cultures. In 2019, Rita earned her doctorate in human and organizational learning from the Executive Leadership Doctoral Program at the George Washington University, where she has researched the role of organizational history within the organizational identity dynamics of Sherwin-Williams following its acquisition of Valspar. Rita's organizational change and leadership development work has received numerous awards from the International Association of Business Communicators. Rita was also recognized as a finalist in the case competition of the Hot Mamas Project in association with the Center for Entrepreneurial Excellence. And most recently, Rita was recognized with a PepsiCo HR Excellence Award for her innovative talent and development work for PepsiCo's Global Finance Organization in partnership with PepsiCo's University and the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. Rita, welcome to the Workplace Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. That's quite an impressive introduction. I'm humbled.
Well, it is all true and it's all you. So our topic today is on this wide-ranging topic of organizational culture and change. So we were talking beforehand, all the elements that this brings. So if we were to describe what organizational culture is, what are the different factors? How can we define this at the start?
Well, I'm going to go to my roots as a professor, and I teach this at Columbia University. And if we take Shine, who just recently passed away, who is a giant in our field, if we look at his definition and we look at the way that he categorizes it and looks at it and measures it, because it's very difficult to measure culture, right? We see artifacts. If you think of it as a metaphor of an iceberg, we see artifacts at the tip of the iceberg. And then underneath that, we have espoused values and beliefs. And these are all of the way that we, in simply terms, how do we get things done around here? So Shine tells us it's the way that it's a definition of how you teach new members how we get things done. And that is very difficult to capture, to categorize the values that we see that an organization espouses on their website, that they talk about in onboarding, that may be part of performance management or leadership development. That is all important. But the way that we get things done and the way that we solve problems, it's hard to capture that. So that's how I would describe it.
And it's through our interactions, isn't it? So it's how decisions are made, how we handle conflict, if there's a bit of pressure on. And again, as we were talking about beforehand, it's what the culture rewards, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. Can you tell me a little bit about that? Because what the culture rewards, it might have these lovely labels of values on a website, but then it's like, just to get the job done, we'll worry about those values, things later. Tell me a little bit about that.
Exactly. So in terms of embedding values into the culture of the organization, we think about, to your point, how do you reward people? How do we get things done around here, and what is rewarded? And that is a great way of thinking about culture. And the values that are espoused are not necessarily aligned with what is rewarded. It's great in a high performance culture. It should be aligned, but it isn't necessarily aligned. In terms of shifting the culture, so we haven't really gotten into the change piece, but that is a lever that you can most definitely use.
This is something that I'm often talking to clients, and I'm sure you talk to your own clients because I know you have your own practice as well. And you talked about embedding values and embedding behaviors. And in some companies that will have values written on a wall, and some people think, oh, those things on posters. And some people, and I've witnessed, and it's quite effective, it's actually part of their feedback. So when I see this, I'm seeing this value. So again, it's very conscious in their language, and that's part of the culture as well, like international culture as well. Each company has their own language. Tell me a little bit more about that. How do you embed culture?
That's such a good question, and it's quite complex. I would say that if you are looking for behavior change, and I teach this in class, but I also work with clients, right? So from a scientific standpoint, how do you actually embed culture, and how do you embed new behaviors to, let's say, morph the culture or change the culture, or even keep it in the high performance range? So one way is how you reward people. So how you recognize them and reward them. Another way to see behavior change might be through an emerging leader program, a leadership development program. Not a program that's for 2 days, but a program that might last for, let's say, a 9-month program.
Yeah.
So that you're embedding the behavior change through a long period of time. And then those people in that leadership development end up being could be your change agents or your culture carriers. How you recognize people. So the whole recognition program, not necessarily the total rewards piece, but the recognition piece. What do you highlight even in a meeting? What behavior are you as a leader recognizing and saying, I'd like to hear more of that? What are you amplifying that you want to hear more of? That is a way that you can, even at the smallest level and at the team level, you can embed culture.
Yeah, and sometimes I've witnessed it in organizations where at meetings, then if somebody has the courage to speak out, they would say, that was a brave thing to do. Thank you for doing that. And then by doing that, that enhanced that psychological safety then, that it's okay to speak out. Whereas in some certain cultures, then it could be a toxic culture. And then now we have a culture of conflict, or an underhand way of getting things done. So it's nearly about what's the unsaid.
Well, you brought up like some really good topics there. So I'm so glad that you brought up psychological safety. I know Amy Edmondson has really brought that to the forefront, and it's terrific. And then you brought up the idea of toxic culture. So this idea of this systemic way of operating where you can't speak up, where there isn't this idea of inclusivity and diversity of thought, and having the courage to, let's say, speak up, to make suggestions, to fail forward, to courageously fail. So when we think of agile organizations, or we think of just the whole agile way of working, that is a great case study in trying things and creating a more innovative culture. But the idea of speaking up needs to be, if you want to embed that in the culture, it certainly needs to be role modeled by the leaders.
Yeah, and it can be that people have different ideas and understanding what it means to be agile. And I'm often asked about agility. Like my understanding of agility is is that growth mindset, the Carol Dweck piece of work. It's about being resilient. It's about learning to adapt to the new reality, and it's going through that change process quite quickly, the 5 stages, Kubler-Ross, all of these different things. What does agility mean to you? So that's my interpretation. Do you have another take on that, or?
I love the way you describe it. I'm so glad you brought up Carol Dweck and you brought up her work on growth mindset. I actually lean into Susan David's work. So her book, Emotional Agility, and all of her work around kind of self-awareness, the idea that you have a range of emotions. So this is more at the individual level.
Yeah.
So I would think about this more in terms of my executive coaching work, having the emotional agility to identify what's happening, take a moment, kind of look at the big picture, and then react is a lifelong practice. It's not easy. When a team has the agility to be flexible, to look at options without jumping in to what might look like the easy answer. It's up to the leader to facilitate that. It's hard. We know that startups have the ability to do that. So when we saw Elon Musk come in as an example to Twitter, I did some case studies in my class last semester on this. So it was really fun to watch this real time. But what many were observing, including Scott Galloway and others, was that Elon Musk was trying to put in this mindset of we're going to work like a startup with that agile behavior of just working around the clock, et cetera. But this was a bit of a mature organization that had years of success behind it. So to kind of sum up, to capture that agile ability is not easy. You see it we can talk about Pfizer and BioNTech. You see it with the big pharma. They've shifted into this mindset of kind of the biotech firms, and they fund those, but the biotech firms are the ones that are kind of creating the groundbreaking drugs. It's not necessarily the behemoth of the large scale organization that's able to shift and move so quickly. All that said, I'll give you one other example. I did spend some time at PepsiCo. It's an organization that is just known for its high performance culture. When we think about how they shifted during the pandemic, they had a leadership change, right? So that's a culture changer for you. So you went from Indra Nooyi to Ramon Laguerre. And from what I've heard, they might not have, to be able to shift as quickly and pivot as quickly as they did, they might not have been able to do that under the leadership of Indra Nooyi. It took a new leader to be able to do that. However, they have the stability of many from their leadership team that were crossovers. So it's a really interesting question on agile, on the role of the leader, on the role of leadership, and like large scale organizational change and how you shift culture. They're all intertwined and embedded.
It's funny you mentioned that, because my work when I do organizational design or organizational change, it is always about what are your resources that you have? And you might be designing the perfect organization design on paper, yet do you have the people to deliver? And this is where leadership development programs come in, or it might be recruitment, or it may be the change of the leader at the top. And I think what people find sometimes with organizational culture is you need to figure, do you have the right ingredients to create that culture? And that's why every organization is different. And this is sometimes, would you agree that the assumption's a bit like what Musk was making and said, well, it worked over here, so it should work over here, and it's just like throwing in an active ingredient here and hoping for something to happen, and then you're like, why is it not fizzling? And then it's a bit like a chemistry experiment, isn't it, where you really have to know the organization said this is how it ticks, and this is why you need that social capital or people with the social networks to say, actually, we can do this. There's somebody in an accounting department that has that talent or whatever, isn't it? It's
I love that example. I think that you bring up such a good point. And then we can just say, like, culture eats strategy for breakfast, right?
yeah.
That old that adage, but it's culture is formidable.
Mm.
And if you do not understand it, you're not going to get very far in your change effort, whether the leader at top. We see it with I love that example that you gave.
Sometimes I've worked with leaders and they walk into, let's call it a toxic workplace. And there's years and years of behaviors that maybe not have been addressed, or I suppose personalities, that haven't been developed or managed, let's call it that. And then the leader then goes in thinking, this is what my first 100 days is going to be like. It's usually at aggressive targets and different things like that. Whereas it's a bit like the agility is you need to figure out that emotional agility first is, what is the agility of the organization first? And then let's figure out how to turn the ship based on that. Where is the base? And I think that's what's missing, isn't it? That people go in too quickly to make an impact, whereas the long game really isn't thought about. That strategic move to say, listen, what's our reference point here? And then let's shift by degrees. Or should we just do a slash and burn like Musk was trying to do? And let's, and who knows, it could work out. I'm not a fortune teller, but it doesn't seem to be from my perspective.
I think you're right. There's so many examples that come to mind. As a leader that is coming in to an organization that needs to, let's say, turn it around, getting the lay of the land and building your guiding coalition, if we talk about Cotter, so important. And also really tapping into your middle managers, tapping into your frontline leaders that are going to be able to shift the culture and drive it forward is really important. I would assume that a leader that is a new leader. I just did a case study on Lululemon, although it's old, but it was at the time when they went from founder led to going public to then kind of sustaining. And they brought in one leader to go from founder led to like a professional CEO. And his name was Bob Mears. He was the former CEO of Reebok. He took them public, but that was all that he was able to do. And then they brought in a veteran, actually from Starbucks, Christine Day, who was really able to capture the culture, understand the culture, which was missing from Mears, and bring them to kind of where they are. I mean, look how successful they are. Howard Schultz really talks to Christine Day's partnership during his time at Starbucks. So, and you can also look at Starbucks, for example. They brought in one CEO, then they had to bring Howard Schultz back. Now they brought in a veteran from PepsiCo. And let's see how it goes. It's not easy. Steve Jobs was fired from Apple, and then they brought him back and certainly brought them into the 21st century. And the culture and the history is incredibly important to catapulting the organization forward.
And that's where, there's some of these cultural landmines that you keep walking across if you go too quickly and go, oh, and then before you know it, this is, in our work as executive coaches, then it's like people are trying to go, how do I recover from here? And the damage is done. The damage could be long lasting, especially when we talk about trust, which is another factor of high performance teams. And you mentioned the work of Cotter then. So for listeners here listening in, why is Cotter important when it comes to cultural change?
Well, John Cotter is really the father of bringing change management into practice, similar to how Amy Edmondson has brought, for more current times, psychological safety into practice. And his 8 steps on organizational change have been quite helpful to leaders in the last 30, 40 years. So the guiding coalition is one component of that 8-step process. Dates back to Lewin, who was the theory behind that, which is unfreeze, make the change freeze. So that's part of the organization. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's what's really important then as well is when you mentioned Lewin there, that's what a lot of people, I suppose, get wrong, is they don't allow that refreeze to happen. Like there's too much change going on, and I know that happened in one of our public bodies where there was change fatigue going on.
I'm so glad you mentioned that. It's exactly what I was thinking. Change fatigue. People have change fatigue with the pandemic, and then the hybrid work, and the work at home, and then return to work. Complex. And now with the global economy softening.
Yeah, and this then brings me to return to work, or return to the office, should I say, RTO as it's known. It sounds like RTA, road traffic accidents, but so the RTO, return to work, is laden then with opportunities for cultural misalignment, if we call it that, and values to be misunderstood. So, for example, we're talking about a generational thing where certain people don't want to go back to the office, and then where does teaming comes in? How do you develop, I suppose, younger, more junior talent there, and how do you create that talent pipeline? I think, as you were saying before, we're 2 years or 3 years away from some sort of normalizing when it comes to organization culture, and especially if there's change coming up, especially if there's a global recession coming, what advice would you give to our listeners? If I'm a leader listening in now and there's so much flux at the moment, I'm thinking of onboarding so many new people because there's so many, I suppose, talent attrition, and it's a very competitive market for now. And then it seems to be all the good ones that are going, and we're left behind with the underperformers from, what I've heard. How do we manage that cultural dynamic?
So the concept two concepts I like to kind of refer to. One is VUCA. So I'm sure you're familiar with that. The volatile, uncertain, complex,
and ambiguous. Yeah.
And which is not new. And that's been brought to the forefront I would say in 2010, it became kind of popular. So we're living the 21st century certainly has proven that that's the case. You also talked about being agile. So the idea of being flexible, and the idea that this idea that you're practicing, and which I bring from more of a mindfulness, just mindset, that you're going to try something with your team. If it doesn't work, you try something else. You really need to be reflective on and take lessons learned, and do some type of reflective exercise. In the military, they'll call it a hot wash. In the U.S. military, or an after action review. But the idea is, if you can learn from your failures, learn from things that did not work out, you're always going to get better. And that is a more uplifting and positive way, I think, that you can build momentum and continue moving forward, because we just don't know what's going to happen.
And it's been very clear on what the enablers are for success, isn't it? So when I talk to clients, then it's like, okay, is everybody clear on what your espoused values are, the mission and the vision? Let's take that for granted. And are you doing the basics right, like doing your performance reviews, doing them well, having those effective feedback conversations and performance management conversations? And then it's about upskilling your people to be resilient, or leadership development programs, or workshops for teams. These are the things, the elements, the enablers, aren't they, that will allow an organization to be agile and thrive, rather than, let's have a summer barbecue, or or something like that.
Yes. I also think embedding this into your operating rhythm is really important. So that is, how do you communicate? How are you getting things done? Decision making, how are you solving problems? And those things might need tweaks. So that's important as well. What's the overall governance, accountability, all of those things. So I like the capture for that being an operating rhythm. I think that's something else to look at. So we just overall organizational communication. Now you talk about bringing people together in joyful, like, so a barbecue. That could, so with this, let's go back to the whole hybrid work or the return to office. And what I've seen from many of the experts, Sadal Needsley, who is Neely, is a professor at Harvard and Business School, and has written a few books on this, and is really in the forefront of like this whole hybrid work movement and work revolution. Understanding if you are having people in the office, what are you doing with them during that time? Everyone's sitting in the office on conference calls, Zooms all day long, and sitting in their little box. That's not helpful. So the collaboration, when does that occur? And I think you need to be intentional, really intentional about that. And that makes the whole hybrid work piece harder. So to your point on, there's nothing takes the place of the interaction of being in person. Like you and I are having a great collaborative conversation here, and it's terrific. However, if we were in person, certain elements might even be, the sparks might even be stronger. So being very mindful about how you bring your team together in those moments is important.
So it's bringing a focus or intentionality to say, here's what good would look like. Here's an outcome I'd like from this meeting on top of what we plan to do. It's like, how do we increase trust, or how do we have more flexible working? It's adding extra layers of depth in each interaction. That's why it's so complex, isn't it? Organizational culture and change. It's people want to do the surface level stuff to say, listen, let's have the posters on the wall and we'll give people badges of the values. But how do we be intentional with that every day? And it reminds me then, you talk about organizational culture. Remember that Burberry were trying to do a turnaround, and the CEO realized quite quickly, I need to have short and sharp communications with people, a very visible front, but town halls and different things were too much, because people were time poor, didn't have the resources to take people away from their desks. So the CEO started doing these weekly little video snippets. Here we're at now, here's what we're going to celebrate. And then the brand turned around from something that looked haggard and out of touch to something really on trend and on point. And I think that was 12, 13 years ago. And I think that was so innovative at the time to say, actually, what are the resources we have at the moment? And what's the job that needs to be done? And how can we be fresh in a way that we approach that? And I think when we are intentional then and have clarity on the goal, then it's easy to come up with the approach. I think we don't often sit back, and it's a bit like yourself. What's the landscape and what do we need to get to the next step? Slowly rather than quickly, isn't it?
Yes, but also that's a quick win. So let's go back to Cotter for a second. What are some of the quick wins that can be done? And that is an amazing quick win that ended up becoming part of their culture. It sounds like it became embedded into the way that they got things done. So, and the CEO knew from what you're describing that the larger, more formal communication forums were not working, but these small bursts, if you will, were really helpful and really contributed to their turnaround.
And that's where you mentioned that operating rhythm. I really like that, where that became the rhythm then of the week to say, okay, what's today's video going to be about? And now how are we aligned about the strategy? How are we making progress? Here's what our learnings were. So a quick and short, snappy burst of communication. And again, when we talk about, I suppose, newcomers then and onboarding and socialization, then this brings to mind the importance of organizational citizenship, what it means to actually be a solid performer. Not even like a high performer, because I think people are so fatigued from work. I think you just need to be a consistent performer. Say, listen, I'm not looking for a 5 out of 5 in my rating. 3 or 4 is good at the moment if I'm close to burnout, and it's having that normalized as a we reward solid performers. Is there something around that's maybe missing at the moment from both the employee and employer?
Well, what you said really what made me think about, in the high performing organizations that I've seen and worked with over the years and has done research with, if you're new to a role, right? So if you move from one role to the next, typically you're getting a 3. There's no way that you're the highest level. And that's the idea, that you're learning and you're growing. And I think if you give that, if that's part of success with your new hires, that it's a learning opportunity. But not only the new hires, but also someone moving to a new role. Even a CEO, right? Because they're reporting to the board.
Yeah.
So the idea that you're hit solid performance in your first year in that role, that's a good metric to have.
And it is about clarity of expectations, well, and managing expectations. And sometimes when I've gone into organizations as an employee, people are going to say, listen, there's going to be certain periods that are peak periods, and you need to manage your energies to say, listen, we need a recovery period after this, and I think there's a lot to that, especially if you're going into a startup where it's going to the next stage. And I might talk to you about startups later on. Is there certain a piece about managing expectations and clarity expectations for newcomers?
100%. So as a manager of a new hire or someone moving to a new role, it is so helpful to have a first 90-day plan. Who do they need to meet in order to who do they need to meet? What do they need to do in order to be successful? You as the manager want that person to be successful. You don't look good if you bring on a new hire and they're not successful. It's not good all around. So ensuring that they have a solid onboarding plan, and that doesn't mean going to an orientation for 1 day or 2 days. It's a good 90 days to even 6 months. And what are those short-term, let's go back to like wins, that you're going to help that person achieve? And what are some of the longer term wins? And being very clear about that. And you as the manager, and you're moving between coach and leader often. You're player coach. You're moving between that role. How are you going to ensure their success? That's very important.
And speaking of startups, I work with large organizations and some startups, and some of them are getting really successful, so they're mushrooming in size, and then they start thinking about this whole question about organization culture. And some people do it as a paper exercise that we do it every 5 years, and they get so absorbed in it, and then they go, oh gosh, we have to do it again. That is the case, isn't it? Like it's like an organism, like it changes and evolves over time. And so what advice would you give to people who are listening in to say, oh, like how do I avoid being consumed by this? Or actually, is it just we should have one person just focusing on as many aspects of this in the workplace?
That's a lot of questions to unpack.
Yeah, isn't there? Because these are often the conversations I go, well, I start going to the depths, and they're like, oh, well, what can we do right now, and I'm like, you can do this and you can do this, but you need to start considering other factors maybe a couple of months' time. And like, oh, I'm not sure if we have the resources for that. There's a bit of an investment that needs to happen, isn't it, for it to pay off?
Startups is its own. That's its own behemoth, right? So, and depending upon where they are with what stage of the startup and what industry they're in. So, like, tech is completely different than biotech.
Yeah.
Right. So there's a lot, it seems from my experience, there's a lot more there's more stability in what I've seen in biotech. I'm seeing more seasoned leaders. There's more cash. It's completely different than like a Uber startup, right? But one thing that you mentioned that I think is really interesting, should one person be focused on culture? And I would argue no. Culture needs to be embedded in the everyday practices of organizational members. So having one person on point for that, I don't see it that way. I see that leaders need to own this. It needs to be part of how you reward them. And having even from HR programs, HR might define, in the Center of Excellence, might define a performance management program. They may define a reward and recognition program. They own comp and benefits. They might lead and design a leadership development program. But these, to embed them and to actually shift the culture, needs to be owned by the business leaders. So you need to embed it into the day-to-day job of your people.
You have just answered a lot of the questions that I would be answering to clients. And this is where I would go back into leadership development programs or facilitation, say, is everybody clear on their role? Or what do we embed systemically as part of a performance management program? Are we rewarding people for that organizational teaming piece rather than just the task of what they achieve? It's how we achieve.
Exactly. And the high performing organizations that I have seen throughout my career have two components to success in the organization and how they promote people. They hit their numbers, they get their job done, and they grow next generation of leaders. And you are not moving up. And this is in large organization. You're not in the Fortune 500. You're not moving up unless you do both of those things. Mm. So it's what you do and how you do it.
So if I was listening in and I'm curious about my own organization leadership, then what are the key questions that I need to be reflecting on a regular basis?
That's such a good question. Well, I think you have to segment out your organization, right? So you have your newcomers, you have your newcomers, then you have your first time managers. How are they transitioning from individual contributor to leading? And even in that space, you also have folks that maybe not have solid line direct reports, but they have to get things done. So how do they influence the organization? How do they influence people to get things done, even though they don't have a solid line to them? And the peer relationships are very important. So that's one group. Then you have your mid-career group. And how are you going to, the question for that group is, how are you identifying and strengthening your bench for your next generation leaders, right? So that's like that mid-career level. And then at the most senior level, when you get to that level, how are you inducting people into becoming a senior leader? How are you differentiating it? Do you need to differentiate by diversity components or not? It depends on what the organization needs. And how are you preparing those senior leaders to then become like your most highest leaders? So I'd see it in 3 components.
Okay, that is a very, very good advice. So I'm going to finish up with this one. And I have a personal, I suppose, affiliation to this approach is the approach of co-creation. So when change is happening, the easiest way to get buy-in is present the challenge and co-create solutions or models around that, and then you have natural change agents as well. Is this just something because I like this approach, or is there a theory then to support this?
100% agree with you. I love the word co-create. So, but John Kotter does talk about that. And we know it in the research and all of our change efforts that you need buy-in. What's in it for me? How are you getting people aligned? All those pieces. The co-creation as a consultant, I am only going to be successful if my client is successful. So co-creating the solution is going to get success, not me saying, this is what needs to happen. Every organization is unique. The culture is unique. The way that you get things done is unique. And yes, there are best practices, but co-creating, I love that word, is, or that process is going to help, whether it's with one leader, it's a leadership team, it's you pull together this guiding coalition. So maybe you have a group that's responsible for human capital across the organization, and it's a rotating group, but that group's co-creating. That's how you're getting buy-in.
And it is about stakeholder analysis, stakeholder management. Here's the thing, though. It's slow because it's democratic nearly in nature. It's not a bit like what poor old Elon Musk was trying to do was listen, here's how we're going to do it, and I know best. And then you're hemorrhaging.
We know that didn't work. He had complete turnover of his entire executive team. It might be by design, but yeah, that did not work.
Yeah, and look at all that knowledge, and culture leaving. That social fabric has now been ripped apart. And then how do you create a culture based on? Well, it looks to me like it's very leadership because is the leadership is lacking, shall I say, because people are now misaligned in what the company was. At least if you have people there a long time, at least you have they mightn't be completely aligned, but they'll have a similar viewpoint on fake news or how do we operate around here. So it is that, isn't it, that I've heard companies that have had 80% turnover in the organizations, which how do you survive after that?
Right. Then you have an entirely probably new org, and the history, right? You've lost your history. You've lost it becomes a new it morphs into a new organization.
Yeah. And it like I'm often fascinated by leaders who just don't know how to stem the flow, and sometimes it's a leadership aspect, isn't it? Or it's figuring out what are the drivers behind people leaving in their droves, and it sometimes it's back to lack of flexibility or lack of strategic alignment or no strategic alignment or whatever it is. And this brings me to the point of culture and conflict culture. It seems to me that, and I'm only going to do this from an Irish or European context, that
I love that.
Yeah, there seems to be not a culture of conflict where we do it in a healthy way. It seems to be lots of grandstanding, or people like from a conflict point of view often say, listen, well, how do you have different conversations, or how do you negotiate, or how do you influence, especially if you're in a startup, should be plenty of that conflict culture going on to say, actually, here's what we do, and here's how we do conflict, but we do it in a healthy way. We do it in a way that's transparent, like, that transaction analysis where we have two adults debating rather than going into leaving the room and, can't believe that person said that. And then we're doing all this after talk, so that culture in conflict in an organization, I'm just quite curious about that, because that could be quite corrosive to the success of an organization.
Another really interesting question that I think is a lot to unpack there, and I know that's your deep expertise. So oftentimes with my executive coaching clients, I encourage them, if you really being good at conflict and understanding how to navigate high conflict, just conflict in general, that is a superpower. And it is not easy. But if you can get good at that, that's incredibly helpful, because the idea, if we bring in this idea of diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? So we want to have diverse thought. We know that organizations have higher performance, return on investment, et cetera, when there's a diversity of thought. But how do you actually facilitate that from happening? So it comes down to like, how do you navigate conflict? How do you solve problems in a productive way, and not to what you talked about earlier is like, you get up and everyone walks out, and then there's lots of like back talking, behind the scenes talking, and that's incredibly damaging to not be able to address the conflict head on. But it takes a lot of courage, and you need a culture that supports that. And that has to come from the top. And it really, like at the board level, has to support that at the senior executive team.
And I know we keep repeating this, but this is all part of leadership development programs, isn't it? It's about the emotional agility comes from that self-awareness. What are your drivers? So it's behavior, your own inner narratives, inner script, whatever it is, what's driving your behaviors, your emotions. Then we talk about, well, actually, how do we equip people with the tools to be strategic, get on the balcony, if you want to borrow from adaptive leadership. And again, there's so many different facets to this. Is like when I talk to my clients, and they go, "Oh, you're just trying to sell me a leadership development program." I go, "Well, actually, they're one of the key enablers, and
Yes.
I just happen to be within this business, and it's very reassuring that our approach is, I suppose, the best there is out there, isn't it, for the moment, until AI takes over. Let's not go there though."
AI is not leading a leadership development program. They might design elements of it, but yeah, the organizational history and hearing stories. We talk about another way to transmit culture is through stories.
You
lose if you lose your, you talked about turnover. When you lose your tenured employees, you lose the stories.
And then they can be inspirational stories as well, to say, often you see when you talk about startups and when they're the embryonic stage before they go into that mature stage, it's like, here with the stories where this is how we were innovative, or this is what Steve Jobs did before he was just too early with the Edison, before he came out with the Palm Pilot, or whatever, the iPad or the iPhone. There's loads of different stories that are there to say, listen, well, here's how we do things.
Yes.
And again, be careful what stories you tell.
Oh yes.
Yeah. So let's hopefully the stories of something that's healthy, because sometimes we have stories where it's about long hours and different things like that, and the wrong value is transmitted, isn't it?
That's a really good point. Because when you think of startups, we talked about reprieve earlier and giving employees an opportunity for rest. And when you think of startups, and they sensationalize the long hours and working in the garage and whatnot. And you might be in the garage for a long time.
Yeah. Who wants that?
Some people thrive. Founder-led organizations, sometimes that their sweet spot from like a leader standpoint is they're great at getting it from zero. Peter Thiel's book, 0 to 1. They're really good in that phase, and then the more mature, the professional CEO, that's not really their thing. This idea of having an operating rhythm, the idea of having performance management, the idea of training people, onboarding people, any of those things. That's different skill set.
So I know I said one more question, but this is the finally last one. So we talked about leadership there. What has inspired you to, what leaders inspired you, or, to be where you're at today? Who inspires you?
That's such a good question. It's evolved over time, for sure. The world has dramatically changed from when I started my career in 1996. And even if I go back to being in college in the early 90s to where we are in 2023, the world has dramatically changed. I was lucky enough to see Marshall Goldsmith. We talked about this earlier. In my early days of Anderson Consulting, which is now Accenture. And he was talking about his practice. And this is before he became who he is today. And I said, I want to be like him. I want to be him. And that's certainly aspirational. I have seen the professors that I've worked really closely with throughout my academic career and the work that they do. And I've seen others that kind of have one foot in academia, this adjunct professor model, and then having the practice. It's hard in today's day to zero in on one particular leader that is absolutely aspirational. There's so many. I think Brené Brown has really done a tremendous job of bringing in the research and making it comprehensible and actionable. So when we talk about courage and authenticity and vulnerability, I think that's really interesting. Susan David's done a great job. Adam Grant has done a really good job. Tom Peters is just, he's iconic, right?
Yeah.
And Indra Nooyi's leadership, Larry Fink's leadership. I think Accenture has, over the years, has really done, when I look at the 26-year trajectory, they have done a phenomenal job. They remain on top. A lot of inspiration from the U.S. military as well. If you're going to study leadership, I think that that's really important to, and I'm really proud that Columbia has a partnership with West Point. I think that's really important. There's a lot of good leaders to look to as examples. The humility and the ability to be a lifelong learner is so important.
I think so. So we're coming to the end of our podcast now. If our listeners were to get in contact with you, Rita, how might they do so?
Thank you so much for asking that. And I really enjoyed our conversation so much today. If people wanted to get in touch with me, they can reach me on my website at ritameyerson.com, and you can send me a note there. My email address also is rita@ritameyerson.com. You can also read about me on LinkedIn or on Columbia's website. So thank you so much for having me.
Rita, so good. Thank you so much for coming on to the Workplace Podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Workplace Podcast with your host, William Corliss. Our special thanks to this episode's guest for sharing their expertise with us. If you enjoyed this episode, please download and share it. For updates on future episodes and to get in contact with us about any workplace topics, please follow Yellowwood on LinkedIn and Twitter at Different Paths. As always, you can head over to yellowwood.ie for any other information. Yellowwood, your external learning and development partner, provider of executive coaching, facilitation and training. Take a different path to success with your career, leadership, team and organisation.